The pre-dawn silence over the western Bug River on the night of June 22, 1941, was deceptive, thick, and almost palpable. At this hour, when nature pauses before the sunrise, the border bridge seemed like a bridge to nowhere. According to the schedule approved in peacetime, a freight train was supposed to pass over this bridge. The wheels clattered against the rail joints, disturbing the peace, and this rhythmic sound was the last normal sound heard by the people of that era. Moments after the last car disappeared into the darkness, the sky split open. This was not like a thunderstorm or an ordinary explosion. It was as if the air itself ignited, turning into a fiery squall. Thousands of Wehrmacht artillery pieces and mortars simultaneously opened fire, and this roar became the funeral knell for the old world. In 1 second, peaceful life, plans for Sunday, vacations, and meetings, all of it ceased to exist, giving way to chaos, from which one of the most tragic and majestic legends of the 20th century was destined to be born. The Brest Fortress, an ancient 19th century fortification, had long since lost its original strategic significance as an impregnable stronghold. In the era of tank wedges and aviation, brick walls could not serve as reliable protection against a modern army. However, fate decreed that this very place was destined to become the point where the blitzkrieg, the strategy of lightning war, first stumbled. Not against walls, but against the human spirit. Inside the fortress and in the adjacent fortifications, at the moment the artillery barrage began, there were between 7,000 and 8,000 people. It was a complex, overcrowded organism, parts of 2 rifle divisions, border guards, NKVD troops, a hospital, and, most dramatically, 300 families of commanding officers were stationed there. Wives, children, elderly parents who had come to visit their sons. In a matter of minutes, the barracks turned into ruins, burying the sleeping, and the survivors found themselves in hell, where fire, dust, and screams mingled. The strategic design of the German command was pragmatic and cruel. The 45th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht, reinforced by heavy artillery, was allotted only 8 hours to capture the fortress. According to the Barbarossa Plan, by noon on June 22nd, the fortress was to be cleared to open an unhindered path for Guderian's tank group, which was rushing toward Moscow. The Germans were confident of success. They knew the fortress plan down to the smallest detail, knew the location of warehouses and barracks. The element of surprise was supposed to paralyze the will to resist. And indeed, the first hours of the attack brought monstrous destruction. Communication was destroyed immediately. Ammunition and food warehouses exploded or were blocked by fire. There was no unified command. The garrison was broken into isolated groups, not knowing what was happening in the neighboring sector. It seemed that the plan was working, and organized resistance was impossible in principle. However, it was precisely here, at the point of absolute chaos, that a different reality began to form, unforeseen by German staff maps. Instead of panic and mass surrender, which the enemy had counted on, the defenders of the fortress began to act contrary to the logic of military science. Left without commanders, junior officers, sergeants, and even privates took the initiative. In the broken windows of the barracks, in the basements, in the attics, centers of fierce resistance began to boil. This was the first layer of the conflict, a physical clash of machine and man. The Germans, accustomed to quick victories in Europe, where garrisons surrendered after encirclement, encountered something incomprehensible. Wehrmacht assault groups, having broken into the Citadel courtyard, suddenly found themselves under crossfire. What should have been a triumphant march turned into a viscous, bloody, exhausting slaughter for every meter, for every stairwell. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the fortress was a labyrinth of 4 main fortifications: the Citadel in the center and 3 bridgehead fortifications, Kobrin, Tiraspol, and Volin. Each of them became a separate island of resistance. In the Citadel, the defense was led by Regimental Commissar Efim Fomin and Captain Ivan Zubachev. At the Kobrin fortification in the eastern fort, Major Pyotr Gavrilov organized the defense. These people, often unfamiliar with each other before the war, in conditions of complete information vacuum, began to build a new management structure. They gathered fighters from different units around them, creating consolidated groups. This was a miracle of self-organization on the edge of the abyss. Order Number 1, found years later in the ruins, written on a scrap of paper, is a testament to this incredible attempt to maintain order in the center of the apocalypse. The text of the order, composed in conditions where walls were collapsing around, spoke of the distribution of defense sectors and the appointment of commanders. This was an act of the highest will, an attempt to impose one's rules of the game on chaos. But if the external conflict was expressed in the roar of artillery and machine gun bursts, then within the fortress walls, an even more terrible drama unfolded, a drama of physiological survival and moral choice. This was the second, internal layer of the tragedy. The water supply was put out of order in the very first minutes of the raid. The summer of '41 was hot. Dust from broken bricks, soot, and smoke-dried throats, turning thirst into the main torture. Water was nearby. The Mukhavets and Bug rivers washed the fortress, but the banks were swept by German machine gunners day and night. The approaches to the water were strewn with the bodies of those who tried to fill a mess tin or a helmet. A flask of murky water mixed with silt and blood was valued more than gold. It was saved for Maxim machine guns, whose casings required cooling, and for children hiding in the basements. The image of suffering children became a powerful catalyst for resistance. The awareness that their families were behind them in damp casemates gave the defenders that degree of desperation that makes a person fearless. Women who found themselves in the fortress showed no less heroism than men. They bandaged the wounded, using underwear instead of bandages, carried ammunition, and in critical moments even took up arms themselves. But seeing the suffering of children without water was unbearable. There is evidence that mothers, to ease the torment of thirst, tried to give children wet rags soaked in their own urine or collected condensation from the walls. This extreme humanitarian catastrophe did not break the spirit, but, on the contrary, embittered it. For many, the choice of surrender or die no longer existed. Surrender was perceived not as salvation, but as a betrayal of those who huddled against the walls in the darkness of the basements. The Germans, realizing that the frontal assault had failed, changed tactics. They began to methodically destroy the fortifications, using aviation and super-heavy artillery. 500-kilogram and even more powerful bombs were dropped on the fortress. Walls 1.5 meters thick, which would have withstood the blows of last century's guns, crumbled like dry biscuits. The vibration from the explosions was so strong that people lost consciousness from shell shock, even without being wounded. But as soon as the dust settled, shots rang out from the ruins again. This put the Germans in a state of cognitive dissonance. In their worldview, resistance under such conditions was meaningless. Officers of the 45th Division wrote in their reports about the fanaticism of the Russians, that they do not fight by the rules. Here we touch upon the third ideological layer of the conflict. It was a clash of two systems, two world views. On one side, a perfectly tuned military machine, working like clockwork, confident in its racial and technical superiority. On the other, people raised on ideas of self-sacrifice, but also people driven into a corner, defending their land at the most basic, animalistic level. In the Brest Fortress, the myth of the colossus with feet of clay was shattered. Hitler's propaganda claimed that the Soviet state would crumble at the first blow. But the fortress, cut off from the country, not receiving orders from Moscow, continued to fight under the red banner. Incidentally, the banner, hidden by the defenders deep within the fortress, was never found by the enemy. Its salvation became a symbolic act. The fortress might be destroyed, but the honor of the garrison was not defiled. By the end of June, the situation had irrevocably transformed. The front line had rolled far to the east, towards Minsk and Smolensk. The defenders of the fortress, even without precise information, intuitively understood no help would come. The hope that ours will soon return faded with each passing day. And it was here that the psychological turning point occurred, making this story unique. When the hope of salvation disappears, only duty and personal pride remain. People continued to fight not for victory in a battle that could no longer be won, but to sell their lives at the highest possible price. This was no longer a strategic war, but an existential one. The Germans brought sound broadcasting equipment to the fortress walls. They played sweet speeches, promised hot food, medical treatment, and life in exchange for a white flag. They gave hours of silence so that the defenders could come out. And some people did come out, mostly women and children whom the commanders literally forced to leave the cellars to save their lives. But the combat corps of the garrison responded with fire. The culmination of the defense stretched out over time. There was no single final battle. Pockets of resistance died out one by one. On June 26th, the group at the Three-Arched Gate fell. On June 29th to 30th, after a massive assault using incendiary mixtures and tear gas, the Germans managed to capture the defense headquarters in the Citadel. The shell-shocked Captain Zubachov was captured. He would end his days in Hammelburg camp. Commissar Fomin was shot at the Kolmsky Gate, betrayed by a traitor. But the eastern fort, under the command of Major Gavrilov, held out. Gavrilov, a career officer, managed to create the most organized defense system. He learned from the mistakes of the first days, organized hidden posts, and established coordination. Against his handful of fighters, the Germans used a monstrous weapon, 600mm Karl mortars. The shells of these monsters, weighing over 2 tons, left craters several meters deep. The eastern fort was turned into a lunar landscape. On July 23rd, that is, a month after the war began, Major Gavrilov fought his last battle. Wounded, utterly exhausted, sick with typhus, he single-handedly met German soldiers with grenades. When he was brought already unconscious to a German infirmary, the doctors were shocked. According to legend, confirmed by testimonies, German officers saluted this man, whose physical condition was incompatible with life, but whose spirit proved indomitable. This was a moment of truth. The enemy recognized the moral superiority of the defender. But even after the capture of the last commanders, the fortress did not fall silent. This is the most mystical and piercing part of the story. Lone fighters, hiding in the endless underground communications, continued their war. The Germans were afraid to enter the basements. The fortress fired at night. Ghosts in tattered tunics appeared out of nowhere, struck and vanished. German reports, even in August, mentioned skirmishes in the fortress area. The legend of the last defender, who emerged from the underground many months later, blinded by darkness but not having laid down his arms, is based precisely on these facts of protracted partisan resistance. One of the most famous inscriptions on the wall, discovered later, "I die, but I do not surrender. Farewell, motherland," is dated July 20th, 41st year. Think about this date. Almost a month of fighting in complete encirclement. The man who scratched these words on a brick with a bayonet or a bullet knew that no one would hear him. It was a message to eternity. The significance of the defense of the Brest Fortress goes far beyond a purely military episode. On the scale of a gigantic front, the delay of one German division for a month might seem insignificant. But this was the first brick to fall from the wall of German confidence in victory. General Günther Blumentritt would later write that it was in Russia that they first encountered an enemy who did not surrender even in a hopeless situation. Brest became the prototype of Stalingrad. It was here that the psychological foundation of the future victory was laid. The enemy realized that the war in the East would not be an easy walk, but a battle of annihilation. For Soviet people, when the truth about Brest was revealed, it became a source of incredible moral strength. However, the path of this story to the people was long and thorny. For many years after the war, the defenders of the fortress who were captured bore the stigma of traitors or unreliable. Stalin's formula, "We have no prisoners, only traitors," rolled like a heavy steamroller over the fates of heroes. Major Gavrilov went through German concentration camps and then through filtration camps in his homeland, was expelled from the party, and lived in obscurity. The fortress itself stood in ruins, forgotten and abandoned. Only in the mid-50s, thanks to the colossal work of the writer and historian Sergei Smirnov, did justice begin to be restored. Smirnov literally painstakingly, searching for survivors throughout the country, reconstructed the picture of the defense. His radio broadcasts, his book, Brest Fortress, caused a revolution in public consciousness. People learned that those who were considered missing were heroes of ancient scale. Gavrilov was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Other defenders had their honest names restored. It was an act of national repentance and recognition. Today, the Brest Fortress is a memorial where silence sounds louder than any words. Walls riddled with bullets and shrapnel preserve the memory of that summer. Melted brick reminds us of the temperature of that hell. But the main lesson of Brest is relevant in the 21st century. It is a lesson that human dignity is the only currency that does not depreciate. In an age of technology, when wars are becoming increasingly distant and hybrid, the example of Brest reminds us that ultimately everything is decided by man. His will, his choice, his ability to say no to a superior force. This is a story of how ordinary people, not superheroes, but simple guys from Ryazan villages, Caucasian owls, Ukrainian coutures, facing absolute evil, found the strength to remain human. The paradox of the Brest Fortress is that defeat turned into a moral victory. From a military point of view, the fortress fell, but from the point of view of history, it conquered time. The myth, in the best sense of the word, that formed around the defense cleared reality of the superfluous, leaving the main thing, a crystal-clear feat of self-sacrifice. When we look at newsreel footage or feature films about the fortress, we are not looking for tactical schemes, but for answers to eternal questions. What is a person capable of? What is the limit of his endurance? And is there a force capable of breaking those who have decided not to surrender? The final thought brings us back to that pre-dawn fog over the bug. The train that crossed the bridge a minute before the war became history, and the people who remained on the banks stepped into eternity. The inscription, "I die, but I do not surrender," is not just an epitaph, it is a manifesto. It is a code that was passed down to subsequent generations. And as long as we are able to read these words and feel a lump in our throats, the fortress continues to hold its defense. It stands not on the border of states, but on the border of our conscience, reminding us that there are things more important than life, and nothing is more terrible than oblivion. In the silence of the memorial complex, interrupted only by the ticking of a metronome, every visitor involuntarily becomes a witness to that battle that ended many decades ago, but whose echo will never fade.